Okay, and welcome to Lecture 3 on Chapters 7 and 8. So, Chapter 7 dealt with the question of whether or not humanity has free will or whether our lives are completely determined by the nature of the universe around us. So, the first term that we need to understand, or the first set of terms, are those terms that tend to lean towards thinking that humanity is not free and does not, and that our intentions and our experience of ourselves as making choices is to some extent an illusion. So, in a lot of pre-Christian societies, they were fatalistic. And fatalism is the claim that our future is determined by a play of forces beyond our understanding. And a lot of these pre-Christian societies or sort of pagan societies actually personified fate and thought of fate as that force that determined our lives. Like I'm sure are familiar with the fates in Greek thought. And there was the idea that your future is determined, that you have a destiny, and that it's not in your control what your destiny is, and you are just at the mercy of being on whatever destined path that you have been on. And then predestination is sort of a Christianized version of this. And it assumes our every action and every event in the universe is known, if not also caused in advance by God. And it's called predestination. It has the term destination because the idea is that you are predestined, therefore, to go to heaven or hell. Your destiny or your destination is ultimately going to be heaven or hell, and that destiny has been predetermined before you were born by God for reasons only God knows. So of course, like some people have a problem with this. Not all Christians believe in predestination. It typically comes about specifically in Calvinist thought, which is a form of Protestantism. In Catholic thought, for example, like there is free will, and free will is a big explanation for why there's evil in the world, according to Catholic thought. But this is a specific form of Protestant thought. And some people have a problem with it because why would God create me? It wasn't my choice to be created if I'm just doomed to go to hell anyways. Like, what's the point of creating beings that are just going to rot in hell? And hey, if I'm destined to go to hell, it wasn't my choice to exist. That's not fair. I would have rather not existed. So there's just like some justice issues about this. And then notions of sin and how sin plays into this can get kind of confused as well. But it's important to know it's called predestination because it's a Christian form of fatalism where God is the guiding force and the destinations are heaven or hell, and they're predetermined by God. Islam is known to be a very fatalistic religion, and that's true to some extent, but in certain situations there are exceptions. In pre-Islamic Arabia, which is the Arabian Peninsula is where Islam comes out of, pre-Islam, they were an intensely fatalistic society, and that kind of influenced Islam. So there are different schools of thought within Islam. It is not monolithic at all. So, for example, when people are talking about Sharia says this, Sharia says that, like the Sharia law, there are a lot of major disagreements among different forms of Sharia law and different schools that even argue that there are different ways for even determining what the law is, and even methods are disputed. So it's a way more complicated and not monolithic tradition than is often portrayed. So the Mutalizites distinguish between God's necessary or law-like actions and humans' intentional actions. So they believe, yes, like the physical laws of the universe are determined and deterministic and sort of locked into this determined chain of causation, but humans have intention and are capable of having free will. So it's sort of like a certain form of compatibilism, which we'll talk about later. And then the Asherites believe God offers us various actions which we acquire, so there's still some room for choice, but it's still determined by there are specific paths set out before you, and you only can choose among those options. So these are examples of two schools of thought that are not entirely fatalistic, even though on the whole it is true that Islam can be a very fatalistic tradition. So going back to Calvinism and predestination, so the reason why Calvin and Calvinistic preachers like Jonathan Edwards argue that predestination is necessary is because, remember, God is classically defined as omniscient or all-knowing. So Jonathan Edwards and other Calvinists link God's omniscience with the idea that omniscience must mean that everything is determined. So Jonathan Edwards argues that if there is infallible knowledge of future events, if God has perfect knowledge of everything that ever happens, past, present, and future, then the event is necessary, and that it is impossible, but the event should come to pass. So that's sort of the logical proof that's operating here is God is omniscient. If God has infallible knowledge of future events, the events are necessary, therefore predestination, determinism, so on and so forth. So the premise that might not be sound is the idea that if God has infallible knowledge, that means events are necessary. It's hard to pick apart that premise, but that's the premise that's questioned and rejected by Christians that do accept the idea that humanity has free will. So other forms of determinism. So determinism is the idea that everything that happens in the universe is determined by the laws of nature. And this includes human events involving humans, even their intentions, so on and so forth. However, it's a little softer than fatalism and a little broader than fatalism because it does not need to say that any event is inevitable or must happen. It insists only that if certain conditions exist, then a certain kind of event will take place. So it's not making a huge claim about the universe itself as locked into a specific destiny, just that certain conditions definitely produce certain outcomes. So it's just basically the law of causation is real, the laws of nature determine the laws of causation, and if you had perfect knowledge of all of the inputs, you would be able to predict the output. The problem with determinism philosophically is that if we don't have free will, how can we be held accountable for our actions? If we're not truly making choices, then there's no personal responsibility. And so we're going to have to discuss how people address that. The thing that the book doesn't mention, though, is that this isn't necessarily like a real problem, given the fact that there have been societies that were entirely fatalistic, that didn't abandon the notion of personal responsibility and didn't abandon the notion that people should be held accountable for their actions. So there were fatalistic societies like Greek society, like pre-Islamic Arabian society, Calvinist societies, in Scotland, for example. So this isn't necessarily a problem because it doesn't matter what the ontological reality is, whether we're free or not. The issue is that we experience ourselves as free, and accountability might be part of that determined universe that God or the universe itself set into place. So there are some different forms of determinism. Hard determinism is the strictest, narrowest form, and this is popular in the aftermath of Newton. So Sir Isaac Newton came up with Newtonian physics that explains gravity and a lot of the physical laws of the universe when it comes to like non-quantum or non-subatomic reality. And so Daniel Dennett sort of points to what I was saying on the last slide, where Daniel Dennett is a hard determinist, He thinks everything is just the playing out of the physical laws of the universe, including our lives as human beings. But he asks the question, for example, do you feel imprisoned on planet Earth? In a sense, you are imprisoned on planet Earth. You do not have the resources necessary, I'm assuming, to be able to leave the planet. So, in a sense, you're trapped on Earth. But again, we don't experience ourselves that way. We don't experience ourselves that way. We don't experience the limitations of the limits to our spatial reality. And so it's kind of similar to free will and determinism, where Daniel Dennett would say, we are completely determined. We are just made of atoms that are moving about in a determined way based on, the chain of causation, but we don't experience ourselves that way, and that's what matters, is the experience. So he also points out that hard determinism is really integral to the scientific worldview. So we depend on the belief that every event in the universe, including our own actions, can be explained and understood if only one knows enough about it. But it's been pointed out that human actions, we can't predict what human beings are going to do, even if ontologically you could, if you knew all of the relevant causes going into their action. But there are so many variables, they're like almost infinite, that you would never be able to make those sort of predictions. So again, it's important to embrace hard determinism, according to Daniel Dennett, to have a scientific worldview. But the issue is that we will never experience ourselves as determined because of the level of complexity that we're operating at. So indeterminism, so the idea that we are not determined. So there is some room within the scientific worldview for indeterminism, or thinking that humanity might have some free will. And what they point to is what's called quantum weirdness. So quantum physics deals with the physical laws and operations of subatomic particles. So we're talking about the universe and how it operates on the subatomic, tiny, minuscule level. And the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is stated that we cannot know both the location and momentum of a subatomic particle. So that is one example of quantum weirdness, how at the quantum level there's a lot going on that's really weird and seems like contrary to the common sense experience of the laws of physics that we have at the macro level, like with gravity, so on and so forth. The problem with using quantum weirdness and being like, see, things can be random, there's some movement, there's some unpredictability, there's something in quantum weirdness that might link to free will and choice, and the fact that certain events are not inevitable. The limitation with that is that quantum theory has not officially proven to refute Newtonian physics. So there are a lot of weird things going on, but Newtonian physics still holds up for the macro, non-subatomic level of how the universe operates. So another way people try to get around hard determinism is to say consciousness is something other than the matter and energy of the universe that is dictated by the physical laws of the universe. So if consciousness is something else, it's not reduced to brain processes, maybe our minds are free. So that's another conversation that's happening by people that want to defend free will for the sake of personal responsibility. Okay, so soft determinism is also known as compatibilism because it sort of reconciles the idea of determinism, that everything follows a specific path, like certain input will inevitably produce or definitely produce certain output, with the idea that that personal responsibility is real and that our experience of ourselves as free is real in some sense. So John Stuart Mill, who you read later, is a theorist, a utilitarian theorist, argued that freedom means acting in accordance with one's own character, desires, and wishes. these are the causes of our actions, so we are free, but the product of necessary causes. So again, we experience ourselves as free because we act based on our character, desires, and wishes. It's just that he accepts the reality that these, our character, desires, and wishes, are the product of necessary causes. Okay, so Hume additionally says that we can make sense of the notion of voluntary action only because there is uniform connection between our motives, etc., and what we do. So these forms of compatibilism are sort of like what Daniel Dennett was doing, that we experience ourselves as free actors with intentions carrying out our intentions, and it's sort of irrelevant what the ontological reality is because we are acting in according to our desires, and that's what true freedom is. You don't have to get more metaphysical about freedom, sort of their version of compatibilism. So, sort of a different conversation included in this chapter was Harry Frankfurt and his definition of a person as someone that experiences second-order volitions. So Harry Frankfurt in this reading sort of discusses in detail sort of a way of categorizing how we experience our will. So volition is sort of another word for will, or to will something in a sense. So first, he distinguishes between first-order desires and second-order desires. So there can be competing ones. So for example, say I had a big dinner, but I also want to eat a Big Mac for dessert. Okay, so my first order desire is I want to keep eating. I want to eat a Big Mac. But another first order desire might be I'm full. I don't want to eat the Big Mac. Okay, so there's this one first order desire that's like, I enjoy eating, I want to keep eating. And another first order desire, I don't want to keep doing that because I'm full. Then there are second order desires, which would be I want to stop eating because I don't want to be overweight, for example. So that would be an example of a second order desire. So you have these competing first order desires, which are sort of brutish, appetite kind of things, really immediate desires. And second order desires are sort of the next level, where you think about your first order desires and make preferences about what desires you want to have. And then he makes an even further distinction between second order desires and second order volitions. So second order desires are to want something. Second order volitions are a little bit more complex, where you say, I want to want something in such a way that I actually carry it out. So it's being concerned with your actual will and actions in this whole structure of first order and second order desires. So again, second order desires are I want to want something. Second order volitions are I want to want something in such a way that it becomes my will. So second order volitions take some sort of awareness of competing first order desires, and that second order desires might not be strong enough to conquer the first order desires that work against you, and it's to want that victory, to want your will and the reflective nature of your will to prevail. Okay, so he says wantons are individuals that don't have second order volitions. They might have first order desires and second order desires, but they don't have second order volitions. And he defines a person as someone with second order volitions. So this can be problematic for non-paradigmatic persons that have that are mentally handicapped in some way. Children, some children might not be considered persons. So this is a problematic distinction, but we'll just put that aside and just try to understand what he's trying to say. So he uses the example of an unwilling addict and an addict that's sort of indifferent. So you have two addicts, they're both addicted to a drug, The wanton has first order desires to keep using the drug because they enjoy using the drug, and also first order desires to stop using the drug because it's ruining their life. They might have second order desires where they want to stop using the drug so they can have a real life, but they lack second order volitions, where they lack the desire for this to really quit and for this battle between doing the drug and not doing the drug, the battle to end in such a way that you stop doing the drug, and that's the triumphant desire. For your second order desire to prevail over this this tension between these first order desires. They lack that. So the unwilling addict is someone that has a second order volition where they want to quit and they want the desire to quit to prevail in their will and become manifest in their behavior. So that's the example that he gives for distinguishing between wantons and persons. So this was just a helpful way of thinking about maybe how we experience our will and why we sometimes do things that we don't really want to do, and sort of sort through the complexity of that reality. So, some questions from this chapter. What are fatalism, determinism, predestination, and compatibilism? So fatalism, the definition was on the first slide. It's that everything is determined by some sort of force like fate, and that everything is determined and inevitable. All events are inevitable. Determinism, just determinism on its own, doesn't mean that all events are inevitable. It just means everything is guided by the laws of nature, and with certain causes of certain effects will definitely follow. Predestination is sort of a Christian form of fatalism that believes that humans are predestined to go to heaven or hell. And the reason for this is because God is omniscient, and you kind of take the jump from God knows everything that's going to happen in an infallible way to everything must be necessary, that it happens in a certain way, to therefore humanity is predestined for heaven or hell. Compatibilism is concerned that determinism results in problematizing the notion of personal responsibility. So compatibilism, also known as soft determinism, tries to reconcile a form of determinism with the fact that we experience ourselves as free and must necessarily experience ourselves as free for like a functioning society. Why do many philosophers try to avoid hard determinism? I basically explained that in the definition of compatibilism, because many philosophers are concerned that hard determinism requires one to throw out any notion of personal responsibility. But again, that's problematic because maybe a society that holds people accountable is just part of the determined reality. So that would make more sense as to why there were fatalistic societies that still punished criminals, for example. According to Frankfurt, what are first order desires, second order desires, and second order volitions, and explain his definition of a person using the example of an indifferent and unwilling addict. So first order desires are immediate desires that might contradict each other. I want to eat a cheeseburger. I do not want to eat a cheeseburger. Second order desires are desires that to desire something. So they are desires that want certain first order desires to prevail. So a second order desire would be, I want to not eat the cheeseburger because I want to lose weight or something like that. And second order volitions are a little bit more complicated because they have to do with the will. So I want to stop to not eat the cheeseburger, and in such a way that I actually don't eat the cheeseburger. So second order volitions are desires for certain desires to prevail and for your second order desires to become manifest in your behavior. And the example of an addict would be an indifferent addict is a wanton because they might have competing first order desires to use and not use the drug, and they might have a second order desire to quit, but they don't have a second order volition for the battle between these first order desires to be resolved in such a way that the second order desire prevails. And an unwilling addict is a person because they want to stop using the drug in such a way that they will actually stop using the drug. So they have a second order volition to stop using the drug, and for the first order desire to not use the drug to prevail in their will. Okay, so the next chapter is ethics. I'm going to go through a few slides in this, and then we'll have a second part to the lecture. So this chapter distinguishes between ethics and morality. So this is a common distinction in the way that it's put forth in the textbook, but in the discourse, you can kind of just confuse ethics and morality. This isn't like a really important distinction. So ethics is concerned with the foundation of morality and providing general principles that will both help us evaluate the validity of a moral rule and choose among different moralities. So ethics is sort of broader, and it's just concerned with what does it mean to be good, what is the nature of goodness, and what is the path to getting there. And meta-ethics is the conversation about the nature of ethics. So for example, when we say this is a moral rule, does that mean like out there in the universe exists this moral rule and we need to obey it, and therefore everybody must obey it because we all exist in the universe? Or is a moral rule just because someone says so and it doesn't really have any moral authority? So that would be a meta-ethical conversation, and we'll revisit that conversation and some terms to help sort through it. Morality is a set of fundamental rules that guide our actions. So morality is sort of dealing with moral dilemmas, situations, and how to behave in those situations. So that's the distinction the chapter makes. So revisiting that meta-ethical conversation, is morality relative? So before we get there, I think it's helpful to distinguish between objective morality and subjective morality. So objective morality means that moral truths and moral value judgments are somehow embedded in the fabric of the universe. They exist as objects out there to be discovered, and therefore we are all beholden to them. Versus subjective morality is the idea that morality doesn't exist independently of human beings or subjects deciding for themselves what is good, what is bad. So where objective morality is discovered, the book talks about the tablet of virtues, like a tablet in the sky with a bunch of rules. That's where it comes from. It exists out there as an object for us to discover. Versus subjective means created, that human beings create value judgments. They do not exist independently of us. So, if morality is subjective, people often argue that means it is relative. And two forms of relativism are ethical relativism and cultural relativism. Ethical relativism argues that morality is relative to every individual. Every individual creates their own sense of morality, and they might influence each other, but that there is no independent reality to morality and ethics outside of each individual creating it for him or herself, and therefore morality and moral truths are relative. They are not fixed. They are relational. Cultural relativism is the idea that morality is different in different parts of the world across cultures. There are major differences in moral guidelines throughout different cultures, and that no culture is ultimately right or wrong. That each culture creates moral codes for themselves, and therefore there's a sort of relativism among different cultures. So you can see the connection between thinking morality is subjective and how that results in these two forms of relativism. The fact that there are major differences across cultures is often used as an argument for claiming that morality is relative and therefore subjective. So, a lot of ethicists try to argue that subjectivism and arguing that morality is subjective is terrible and horrible because there's no such thing as moral authority, therefore, and it's just a free-for-all, and there's no basis for saying something is good or bad, it's just everything goes. And that's not quite true. So actually, you read about utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill makes it very clear that utilitarianism is a form of subjective morality. It's aware that it's subjective. So, for example, in utilitarianism, it's based on the idea that people want to experience pleasure and want to avoid pain. And it might not be the case that the value of pleasure over pain is objective. It doesn't exist out there in the universe. It's just every subject is in consensus that that's good. So in a way, pleasure being better than pain is a subjective standard. Based on that subjective standard, it's not a value judgment to say that slapping someone across the face isn't as good as not slapping them across the face because pain is involved. So based on the subjective standard that pain is bad, it's wrong to slap somebody across the face. So you can still say it's wrong to slap somebody across the face for no reason, and still believe in subjective morality. You're just claiming based on a subjective standard that is true. So another example that doesn't involve morality would be a race. So you could say the best car in the race is the one that got in first place. So if you have to accept for that value judgment to be true, that that's the best car, that the best car is the one that finishes first. That's a subjective standard. It's not out there in the universe that the best car finishes first. That's just something that all subjects are in agreement at the race. That's the point of the race. And based on that subjective standard, we can say, okay, this car is the best, even though it's not objectively true. It's based on a standard that is ultimately subjective. That subjective standards are a way of anchoring subjective morality in such a way that it acknowledges that there's some consensus. So it's a way of saying that there still might be some reality to moral claims, and it's not just an everything goes form of metaethics. So the appeal to nature. So first of all, another way of thinking about morality is natural law theory, that along with physical laws of the universe, there are moral laws of the universe. The problem with that is physical laws of the universe seem to be very different. That's because, and we know this because you cannot break the physical laws of the universe. But if there are moral laws, we can break them. So that might be a difficulty with natural law theory. And speaking about like sort of nature and the fabric of nature, we read John Corvino's dismantling of the argument that homosexuality is bad or morally wrong based on an appeal to nature. And I think this is worth kind of walking through because people try to use nature and the appeal to nature as an argument for and against all sorts of things. And the appeal to nature is actually a fallacy. And one of the reasons it's a fallacy is because how do you even define nature? Like human beings are totally a part of nature. So everything we do is nature acting through us, in a sense. There's no such thing really as the artificial because there's no clear line. So the appeal to nature also doesn't work because we don't use it in a uniform way. Much of human civilization is the enterprise to rise above nature. There's nothing natural about the fact that I wear contact lenses on my eyes to be able to see. You could argue that's unnatural. So is that morally wrong? We don't use it in a coherent, consistent way. So those are some general reasons why the appeal to nature doesn't work. But he gives some more specific ones, specifically applying it to the homosexuality example. So people often argue homosexuality is unusual and therefore it's wrong. But unusual does not mean bad. In so many other situations, you can be unusually smart. Exceptional people are often praised for the fact that they have unusually or exceptional traits and characteristics. Another reason why this doesn't work is because we shouldn't be, often in the example, people try to say homosexuality is bad because non-human animals, the non-human animal world sort of demonstrates that it's unnatural. So first of all, there are over 1,200 non-human animal species that have been demonstrated to exhibit homosexual behaviors. So that's not true. But even if it were true, so much again of the human enterprise is distinguishing itself from the rest of nature. So using non-human animals as a guide to our behavior, that would be inconsistent to just randomly use that for this example. He also points out that there are limitations to the Born This Way movement, that the strategy of a lot of people combating homophobia is to actually reinforce the appeal to nature and just try to argue that homosexual people are born this way, that that's their natural disposition. And it's sort of, he says it's important to note that innate desires as a whole, including sexual desires, are not always good and not always bad. The fact that they are innate is disconnected from our evaluation of them. And that feeds into his argument that there's not really a whole lot of choice in any sexual feelings. The problem with this part of his argument is that the Catholic Church, for example, with the prior pope, had a position that it might be the case that homosexual desires are innate in people that experience them, but you have the choice not to act on them. So this distinction between sexual feelings and choice was an acknowledgement by the church, for example, that you don't choose your sexual feelings, but you choose whether or not to act on them, and that's what matters. And then finally, he points out the argument from disgust that some people think homosexuality is wrong because they experience disgust thinking about people engaging in homosexual acts, that argument doesn't really work. I mean, a lot of what happens and unfolds in the medical establishment is pretty disgusting. Like dealing with human bodies in a medical way is viscerally disgusting, like across the board. Thank God there are doctors and medical professionals that can put up with that disgust for our benefit, but using disgust as a standard, again, you're not using it consistently and coherently across the board, so it's not fair to apply it in this specific example. So another conversation in this chapter is, are we naturally selfish? I misspelled selfish there, sorry. So psychological egoism is the argument that human beings always act in their self-interest. And I want to make a distinction between egoism and egotism. So egoism applies to psychological egoism, just the idea that our actions are self-interested, an assertion of the ego. And there's ethical egoism, which is we should act in our self-interest. So those are two forms of egoism, and that's different than egotism. To be egotistical is to be very boisterous and self-asserting, and to have all sorts of character traits that are really domineering, and that's different than egoism, which just means You either are always acting in your self-interest or you should always act in your self-interest. So again, psychological egoism is that human beings always act in their self-interest. It's descriptive. Ethical egoism says that human beings should always act in their self-interest. It's prescriptive. And altruism is the idea that is the belief or idea that people might act outside of their own interest or be self-sacrificing for the benefit of others. And one of the meta-ethical conversations is altruism ever possible? So if someone dies for a cause, maybe it was in self-interest because dying for the cause was something that made them feel better than living and abandoning the cause or not dying for the cause. So you could argue it was still self-interested. Joseph Butler gets around that argument by pointing out that acting on one's desires does not make an action selfish. A little bit further, he says the satisfaction that accompanies good acts is itself not the motivation of the act. So the motivation of laying down your life for a cause would be your belief in the cause, an investment in the cause, and the desire for the cause to improve the world, not the satisfaction that you're dying for something you believe in and sort of the benefit of thinking of yourself as like a good person. That wouldn't be the motivation of the act. Morality and sentiment. So sentiment is feeling or emotion. And we're going to talk about two thinkers that believe that all morality is based on sentiment rather than reason and rationality. And that the basis of morality is sympathy or fellow feeling or connecting your own feelings and emotions with the feelings and emotions of others. So David Hume, again, appears in this chapter. And his moral system is based on empiricism, which means it's just how we experience ourselves. He says his system is based on experience, that reason cannot tell us what we want. And sentiment is grounded in pleasure and pain, and that's what dictates most of our actions. He also makes the point that it is impossible to derive an ought from an is, that a lot of people commit the logical fallacy of jumping from a description to a prescription. So for example, the description of the psychological egoist that people always act in their self-interest, it is a logical fallacy to jump from that to conclude, therefore they should act in their self-interest. So that's an example of David Hume's argument that it is impossible to derive an ought from an is. Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued, again, that sentiment is the basis of morality, but that sentiment is sort of tied to a natural reason. So he sort of breaks down the binary between emotion and reason. And he says that we all possess a conscience. Again, remember we talked about how conscience is different than conscious. A conscience is like an inner sense of right and wrong, and that your conscience involves the love of good. And that your conscience is dictated by sentiment, and that there's sort of a natural reason or investment in the good, which again would be connected to pleasure and happiness. But the problem with this system is if people disagree, obviously, about moral beliefs, but if it's all based on the conscience, there are consciences that seem to be in tension with one another. So how do we resolve those tensions? And then also we have the question of how do we know our conscience is right? All right, I'm going to stop there, and that is the end of part 1.